behalf of the task force and our co-sponsors, I'd like to thank you all for being here. My name is Ada, and I am a student leader with the Immigrant Youth Task Force, a UCLA organization dedicated to advancing research, advocacy, policy, inter-campus collaboration, and community engagement to promote the well-being of immigrant youth and families in Los Angeles County and beyond. We are joined by our co-sponsors, Pediatrics Interest Group and LA Human Rights Initiative. The Pediatrics Interest Group at the David Geffen School of Medicine strives to educate medical students about the vast field of pediatrics and encourage awareness of issues pertaining to children and their families. The LA Human Rights Initiative is a student-run asylum clinic which provides pro bono forensic medical evaluations for individuals seeking asylum in the US. Finally, this is just a reminder that the session will be recorded and streamed live on Facebook. If you would like to be added to the IYTF mailing list or are a student who needs proof of attendance, please fill out the form in the chat box. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Professor Abel Valenzuela is a professor of urban planning and Chicano studies at UCLA, as well as director of Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UCLA. Professor Hiroshi Motomura is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law. This panel will be moderated by Professor Jennifer Silvers, a professor of psychology at UCLA and director of the Social Affective Neuroscience and Development Lab at UCLA. We are very grateful that Professor Valenzuela, Professor Motomura, and Professor Silvers have taken the time to be with us this afternoon. I will now turn it over to our distinguished moderator, Professor Silvers.
Thank you, Ada, and thank you to all of those who are joining us this afternoon to discuss these very important issues at the intersection of immigration, politics, labor studies, and public health. Our goal is to make this session as interactive and as accessible as possible. So please post any questions in the chat and we will answer them to the best of our abilities in the second half of the webinar. We will be prioritizing questions that are not specifically addressed during the presentations of our two panelists. And again, as was mentioned in some of the advertisements, if you would like to listen to the webinar in Spanish, please dial 605-313-4434 and then the code 829406.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a Conversaciones sobre la Salud Inmigrante. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros esta tarde. Hoy nuestro programa se titula Esenciales y expuestos los trabajadores inmigrantes durante una pandemia. Mi nombre es Flor Ramírez y estaré simultáneamente traduciendo en español. Para la versión en español, por favor llame al 605-313-4434 en su teléfono y luego oprima 829406. Desafortunadamente, dependiendo en su plan telefónico, puede o no cobrarse un centavo por minuto. Finalmente, esta conversación será grabada y transmitida en vivo por Facebook. Gracias.
All right, so our first speaker today is Professor Abel Valenzuela. Professor Valenzuela is a professor of urban planning and Chicana studies at UCLA, as well as director of the Institute. Oh, sorry, hold on one second. My screen just changed a bit. I want to make sure I have you all here still. Okay. As well as Director of Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UCLA. In his role as Special Advisor to the Chancellor on Immigration Policy, Professor Valenzuela works with campus experts, including students, to enhance UCLA's global connections and to engage immigrant students in their UCLA education. His research interests include precarious labor markets, worker centers, immigrant workers, and Los Angeles. His research on day labor and immigrant labor markets have helped frame national public and policy narratives on immigrant and low-wage workers, and he has published numerous articles and technical reports on the subject. We are thankful to have Professor Valenzuela with us to discuss the role of essential workers during the pandemic.
Okay, I have unmuted myself. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, many thanks to the Immigrant Youth Task Force for putting together this important conversation and for inviting me to participate. I want to give a special shout out to ex-student Michelle Cervantes, who's a recent graduate of labor studies. She belongs to the first cohort of bachelor degree recipients in labor studies in the entire University of California. We now offer a major in labor studies, the first of its kind. She is also a relentless and committed organizer, an example of what students can accomplish and contribute as we begin to shape, organize, and mold a post-pandemic recovery for workers and immigrants. Of course, we are in the second surge in the first wave, and that has implications for workers now. And that we will, of course, discuss today. But I do want to, in part, get ahead of myself in terms of thinking of recovery and what that might look like and how we might channel some of our efforts that way. I have 5 short slides after this one that I'll share closer to the end of my comments. I'll begin by covering a few key facts or context that I hope gets us thinking about essential workers and their exposure during this horrific pandemic. So the first is vicious cycles of work and death, with the emphasis on cyclical, right? Were we not here a few months ago, during March, April, May, when the country was starting a lockdown, when stay-at-home orders were being implemented, and when we shuttered our economy, we literally transitioned to reliance in a great way on essential and frontline workers to care, to feed, to shop for us, to deliver goods to those of us who could afford, literally, to play hide and seek from the virus. Many of us, for the first time, subscribed to Instacart and started thinking much differently about goods delivery and similar jobs as the pandemic overtook our lives and terrified us from shopping and compelled us to engage differently. As we enter a second wind or spike in what is the first wave of this pandemic, there is increased pressure to open our economy. And that's coming all the way from the top with a complete and total and blind ignorance to the pandemic, including the cynical and heartless policy to require international students to take in-person classes or have their visas revoked in a desperate ploy to pressure universities to open. In effect, putting international students and faculty in increased danger to exposure and death. The increased and political pressure to open the economy, one that is increasingly fragmented and very much reliant on services, frontline workers, and other pandemic-exposed jobs will bring even more harm, destruction, and death to immigrants, people of color, women, and other workers who continue to toil and work to survive. Here is my point, or my first one. We have more of the same. An unequal, previously robust economy that has shuttered down and unemployed workers who are increasingly becoming desperate for work in those jobs that are opening or in demand, which are by definition essential and frontline opportunities. In essence, this is becoming a vicious cycle of pandemic spikes, employment and unemployment, leading to spikes and to closures and then reopening. This vicious cycle of economic opening, employment in essential and frontline jobs, and COVID spikes will continue to ravage and disproportionately impact immigrants, workers of color, women, and other workers. My first point. Okay. Second point. US labor markets are already bifurcated and not at all worker friendly. Let's be clear, our economy pre-pandemic is deeply fragmented by race, gender, and occupational classification that favors employers to the detriment of workers. This isn't new, lots of empirics, lots of evidence. Our bifurcated economy, simply put, between roughly speaking service, retail, and light manufacturing jobs on one end, and high-end financial, professional, and managerial jobs has literally provided a class of pandemic workers who can, quote unquote, afford to work at home compared to those who have lost jobs and are forced to work outside of their homes, increasing the risk to exposure for needing to put food on their table, make rent, and care for their families. My third point, labor markets are also systematically unequal and segmented by race, gender, and immigration status. In many ways, the US workplace is a remnant of plantation capitalism that has embedded a workplace DNA that places workers and their treatment as secondary to output and to production. In America, we have a long history of workplace abuses, unfair treatment, poor working conditions, and this ethos that workers are secondary to owners, stockholders, investors, and those that control production. This belief remains alive and well. This brutality at work, so to speak, is not new. And economic historians actually trace this back to our system of slavery, plantation work and capitalism as an origin point to understand why employers and owners of capital have so much power and exercise it unfairly on rank and file workers. Within this system, we have other processes of exploitation that are utilized by employers under the watch of our federal government, including differences in pay, hiring, and promotion by gender, race, sexual orientation, immigration status, just to name a few. Belonging to any of these categories automatically places a pay or hiring penalty on you. Undocumented immigrants, a very small percentage who hold DACA, find themselves in precarious employment situations, and they were completely left out of stimulus dollars. Immigrant workers and workers of college immigrant workers of color and workers of color, engage unequally in our labor market pre-pandemic and in the current context. Fixing an already broken, unequal, and patently unfair and unsafe labor market will be tricky, but requires our undivided attention and multiple strategies so that more workers emerge as winners after this horrific period. My fourth point, Latinos bearing the brunt of the pandemic inequality. They are especially hard hit. As an example, they make up about 40%, 39% to be more accurate, of California's population, but 55% of California's COVID-19 cases. I believe this figure is higher for LA County. In addition, Latino residents are more than twice as likely as white residents to contract the virus. Immigrant-rich neighborhoods like Pico Union or the Mission District of San Francisco report high rates of positive testing, in part, and let's be clear, related to density, overcrowding, and few public gathering spaces. The environment, the neighborhood matters. And for poor folks, people of color, and for immigrants, they are at a distinct disadvantage, most of these folks being Latino. Job growth and pandemic opportunities. These are extremely limited, and to the extent that you query or survey these opportunities, you will find increased work opportunities. I'm not talking about millions, but there are work opportunities that will generate an income, but also places you at greater risk of exposure. For example, Amazon has hired extra delivery workers in the hundreds of thousands. And you've seen the proliferation of delivery services, including Instacart and many large-scale box stores such as Target, creating their alternative delivery services that basically allows any one of us to work a second job or to take this as a primary job, albeit temporarily or maybe not, maybe full-time, to do our shopping. Capitalism is crafty, it's flexible, and shifts with the times to take advantage of new profit-making opportunities. This is occurring now, but opportunities seem to be flowing towards precarious opportunities, including temporary and very dangerous work. My last point, complacency in a time of pandemic crisis is dangerous. As we shelter at home, as we adjust to this new world and norm, and as we become complacent, so to speak, in our new home and work environments, we mustn't lose sight of labor laws, regulations to protect workers, and adjustments to workplace crises that emerge as a result of this pandemic. Our inattention would be costly, and so careful monitoring, enhancing protections, and more importantly, thinking of an equitable and inclusive recovery becomes even more important and critical as we move forward. So now let me get to the slides that I quickly put together for today's webinar. The first three basically provides you with, or the next three basically provides you with what I hope will be a more thorough or a better description of what we mean when we talk about work sites, essential workers, frontline workers. So this first slide from LA County, you don't have to pay as much attention to the numbers per se, but if you look at the industry business types, you can see food processing, apparel, manufacturing, law enforcement, manufacturing. So you might want to place some faces or some imaginary reflection on who these workers might be and how they might look. The next slide, if you don't mind changing, there we go. It's similar to the previous slide. What I'd like you to note is the type of essential workers. On the left-hand slide, you have transportation and material moving, for example. These are many of their logistic workers, but also folks who drive those United Parcel trucks, for example, and Federal Express and postal workers, healthcare practitioners, of course, and as well as personal care and service. To the right, you have essential workers in occupations that are low wage and that have a high share of workers that are below or right at the poverty threshold. Sorry for that noise background. So their economic situation is already adding to their already precarious situation of having to live on a check-by-check basis. And here we're talking about personal care aides, cashiers, of course, laborers and stock workers at grocery stores, as an example, registered nurses, stock clerks, cooks. We can go to the next slide, slide 3. I think it's important and it adds a layer of complexity to think about essential workers as well as frontline workers who are at the greatest risk of exposure, more so even than essential workers. And here we're talking about healthcare workers, grocery convenience and drugstore workers, childcare, social services, public transit. So these have just a slightly greater, if you will, level of exposure. And so I point them out because it's a nuanced frame to think about labor markets. And we need to pay attention to that if we're to fashion policies that are thoughtful and engaging. Let's go to slide 4. These examples, I think, came out in my comments. But these are national level disparities. Just a few examples. Gender matters. Workers in frontline industries are disproportionately women. Race matters. People of color are overrepresented in many occupations within frontline industries. Immigration status also delineates. Low income is also a factor. And we know that building cleaning services has a particularly high influence of uninsured workers. So at the national level, disparities by race, by gender, immigration is ongoing, not just in California. The last slide, and here I'll close, has to do with worker rights. And this is just one component of intervention. You might think of this as a supply side or a worker intervention, a worker rights approach, which should be a part of a larger, more holistic approach, including interventions from the state, federal government, private industry, civil society, including government jobs and community-based organizations. There is political, student, and other pressure points that we can exercise to effect change, particularly as the pandemic flattens, I hope, and our country moves to seriously open. An opening that moves beyond the status quo of labor market inequality to a more inclusive and fair labor market for all workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, that excellent presentation. And if you have questions, you can either post them in the chat right now, or if you would like to hold on to them, we will be holding all questions for the Q&A, which will happen in just a moment. I'm sorry, I'm after our next speaker, not just a moment. Hold on to your questions or put them in the chat. Okay, so thank you, Professor Valenzuela, for that wonderful presentation. We will now hear from Professor Hiroshi Motomura. Professor Motomura is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law and a scholar of immigration and citizenship with influence across a range of academic disciplines and in federal, state, and local policymaking. He has written 2 general audience books, Americans in Waiting and Immigration Outside the Law, and co-authored 2 law school case books. His scholarship has helped shape the development of immigration law and policy in several key areas, including the adoption of DACA and the setting of limits on immigration detention. He is currently at work on a new book, The New Migration Law, with the support of a Guggenheim Fellowship. We are thankful to have Professor Motomura with us to discuss the law as it relates to COVID-19 medical and financial support, as well as immigration during this pandemic.
Thank you, and I hope you can all hear me and see the slide here. Yeah, I want to join to thank all the organizers. It takes a lot of work to put something like this together, and certainly really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for attending. This is really an important topic. It's not only looking at the situation now, but also think about what the future holds and what we can do about it. So my job on this program is to talk about some specific issues of legislation, of policy debate, what Congress and state and local governments are up to, both relating to the pandemic and responses to it, and relating, of course, to immigrant workers. But it's also a chance to kind of think about how this fits into immigration law in general. And so I'm going to say a few words about that. I should also add that in thinking about how to approach this today, there's really a couple of ways I could approach this, just to share with you. One is to do it very specifically and to be very detailed about it. And I'm going to give you some details, but I'm not giving you because there are things to remember in details. It's really because they're just illustrations of something else I want to do instead, just to really kind of name the issues. You know, name what's on the table. Name what Congress is debating or ought to be debating now and how things ought to look going forward. So I want to name it that way. To the extent that the slides have particular details on them, they're going to be available afterwards, so you can look at that. So it's another way of saying this won't be on the exam, but that it's just important to really think about the details as examples of some more generic things. So let me give you a quick overview. I'm going to talk really about COVID-related issues, say a little about medical care, unemployment insurance and medical leave, federal financial aid and emergency grants for students, state and local programs, and then pivot a bit to immigration issues that are related, I think, to COVID and the future in general. One is how this relates to the much more stringent rules we have now about so-called public charge. And the other is to think about what lies ahead. I mean, are we looking at giving legal status and what that's going to look like? So that's just kind of a quick overview. And I'll try to walk through all those things and, invite you throughout this session to put questions in the, I guess it's the chat or the Q&A, I guess, whatever screen you've got in front of you. Okay, so, first let's talk about medical care. I mean, one of the things that we're looking at with unemployment is the loss of health insurance. And so, again, it's a huge number. And so we're very much in a crisis that hits not only people who have low income, who maybe never had health insurance in the first place, but even those who did are at greater jeopardy. And so you've got to look about this in terms of, for low income, we have federal Medicaid, and that's free medical care, but that's actually quite restricted. Non-citizens are generally eligible, only if they've been lawful permanent residents for 5 years. There's exceptions to that for people who get asylum, for example, and others. But and there are other medical programs for children and pregnant women. This isn't about learning the rules here. This is really more about naming issues, and this is a serious problem in this country. Is probably goes without saying. The provision of medical care, and so this is an area where even lawful permanent residents are left out. And of course, that becomes much more of a problem if people are losing health insurance because they're losing their jobs. Now, it turns out that state-funded Medicaid may have broader eligibility rules. That's going to vary from state to state. But if you don't have regular Medicaid, you can have emergency Medicaid if you're ineligible for Medicaid. And so if you're undocumented, I mean, this is the story of getting emergency help in that situation. And so a lot of what you might be looking at is emergency Medicaid as opposed to regular Medicaid. There's a state option that says that COVID testing, prevention, and treatment counts as emergency Medicaid. And California's exercised that option, and a lot of states have not. And so you have, but this is, again, not the details, just to give you the picture of how the public health system, I think, in this moment is really being tested in a way that hasn't been tested before in the last, at least not the last 100 years. And so this is something that's going to require attention. Okay. And then another big area, again, I'm just naming big buckets of issues. One is medical care, another is unemployment insurance and medical leave. What's that look like? And what should Congress do about this? So Congress enacted a provision that provides $600 a week extra in federal funded payments, but we're literally a couple of weeks away from its expiration. And that's on top of this is a nationwide average of what unemployment is. So when you are looking at losing $600 a week in federally funded payments, you're really looking at losing quite a bit. And there's a big tussle in Congress right now. I mean, literally the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership on this are $2 trillion apart in the size of the package that they're willing to authorize. And some of this, of course, has to do with the narrative we're seeing at a lot of Republican leadership that we're seeing the end of the pandemic, at least for the purpose of what this help ought to look like. So this is eligibility, though, that's also restricted because one of the things that this has made very plain over time has been that, we have this kind of national hypocrisy of having essential workers who are undocumented. And so unemployment insurance is for workers who work lawfully and are available. Um, so, um, and, um, and it covers, uh, there's legislation, separate legislation that extends coverage to some part-time workers and some self-employed and others who are usually excluded, but that's also a bone of contention. There's also a problem that the system, and I'm sure you read this, there's a big story in the LA Times about this, I think it was yesterday. People have practical problems applying. You know, when they interviewed several people who basically said, look, it's become my full-time job to try to get through on the telephone. We have 7 million claims processed, but there's a lot of people just can't even get through. That's another issue. There is federal legislation on federal emergency paid family and medical leave and some tax credits for this purpose. And there's a paycheck protection program that's kept some enterprises afloat with loans that are forgiven if people are retained as employees. But the reason I raise this again isn't to provide the details, is to tell you what the issues are and to show that this is what is being debated right now, and we'll see if Congress actually does something, literally in the next 2 weeks before this deadline, because the details of whether $600 or $400 or $1,000 isn't going to matter if it all expires. And also notice that this is keyed to work authorization, so it excludes a lot of people who, in many ways, are the essential workers. Federal financial relief, you've heard of the CARES Act. You know, these are some figures here of what we've got with regard to payments made to people, and for dependents, but dependents 16 years and younger. By the way, I mean, this one of the big problems with this is that it leaves out people who are dependents who are 17 and older, which is a lot of people in college right now. Okay, and the amount declines. I mean, again, these rules don't matter as much as this is what's on the table, this is what's being discussed, this is what Congress is debating. But here's the problem. This is tied to Social Security numbers with work permission. And it's even worse from a coverage point of view, because if a married couple files jointly, both need work authorized Social Security numbers. And so this is a way to say that if they're mixed status families, of which there are, of course, very, very many, that everyone in the family, or I should say no one in the family gets these payments. And the same is true as you have dependents or US citizens, but if the tax return includes a taxpayer ID number. I raise this, again, not for the details, but the issues are, I mean, this is a way to use the federal stimulus payments to, actually quite directly enforce immigration law against very vulnerable families. That's really what it comes down to. These restrictions are being challenged in court right now. Part of the problem we're having right now is that it's part of it, you can challenge these bills in court, but at the same time, the question is what happens next? Is there going to be another set of provisions? Okay, that's further legislation. It's important to remember. Next big thing that is kind of close to home on a campus is emergency grants for students. You know, the CARES Act also issued grants to colleges and universities that included emergency grants to individual students. And in theory, that would close the gap to help people who are students who are not going to get the other payments because they're too old, and they're dependents, and because they're dependents, they can't get them on their own. Okay, here's the issue there, and this is a serious problem because the Department of Education has excluded DACA and undocumented people. And they've been sued on this, and there have been some injunctions issued, and including one that covers the California community colleges. That is, being challenged in court. The problem here is a practical one, and that is that I'm telling you a lot of things that are kind of old law in the sense, because the real issue is what's the next round going to look like, and will these same, will Congress make it more clear that the Department of Education can't do this? Because I think the Department of Education did it in a way that was actually not authorized by Congress. That's the whole point of the legal challenge, is to say to the Department of Education, hey, you did something that actually is inconsistent with what Congress did. Um, okay, another big thing that I think is worth identifying, I'm going to be less detailed here, but because this is so evolving, but if you, as you think about what the future looks like, issues to work on, issues to mobilize around, issues to get in the weeds about, because the details really matter. Think about, you know, it's so-called disaster relief. There's a reason why it's called disaster relief. I'll get to in a minute, but that looking at public health crisis as a disaster, and so we have, you know, moratoria on rental payments and evictions. This is going to vary by local governments, and in most cases, these are local. We're seeing all around the country. We have rental relief funds, like we have recently approved by the City Council in Los Angeles, and you know, we have food banks, and we have private and public relief funds, including some sponsored by the by local governments. We had the Angelino card with the City of Los Angeles. But the problem with all these issues, or all these forms of relief that we've seen so far, is that the funds are limited. A lot of the funds have been exhausted. A lot of the funds have been distributed by lottery, which of course implies that it's not reaching everyone it needs to reach. And so again, looking ahead, looking at what can be done, looking at what the issues are, these are things to keep in mind. I should add that my list of issues is pretty incomplete. These are just the ones that have attracted a lot of attention, but there's all kinds of things relating to how school districts handle the situation, colleges and universities. And the list is endless because one thing is very clear, you know, very obvious, it really goes without saying, is that the current situation has exposed a lot of the inequities we have in our society. And so in a sense, any solution you could have to make the world and this country and our communities a better place, that need didn't go away during the crisis. It's only become more acute. And I'm only naming the things that have really risen to the top of the legislative agenda. Now, let me shift over to immigration law, but the transition I'm going to make is to look at some of these COVID-related measures and to talk about how they relate to another thing that's happened in immigration law really in the last 6 months, which is, as many of you know, the administration has changed the public charge rules. In other words, there's a statute that Congress enacted many, many years ago. It's been around the books for about 125 years in one form or another. It says that that people are barred from the country if they're likely to become a public charge. That's what it says. But there's a new federal regulation that's the problem because it expands the risk. It really reinterprets this phrase to make it essentially much easier to have a wealth test to become an immigrant. And it basically kicks in when someone is trying to get a green card, become a permanent resident, also when they're renewing non-immigrant status. So it's an obstacle. It's a block. It's a bar that comes in. But I think the thing to remember here is the public charge rules. You know, they don't consider the CARES Act stimulus payments because they're really thought of as tax credits. This is kind of a technical explanation, but this is the reason why they don't hurt you from a public charge perspective. Unemployment benefits are earned benefits. They're not public benefits in the sense that's being stigmatized and penalized. COVID testing, prevention, and treatment has been declared not to, you know, be considered. So this is, again, I'm not trying to give, you know, legal advice, and I'm not trying to give you a detailed sense of how any individual case would be handled, but I just want to point out that that there is some that some of the aid that's pandemic related does not hurt people in public charge, but that the public charge issues remain, both because it's more likely to be implemented as a wealth test, and also because I think the concerns that people have, the fears that people have, the fears of surveillance, the risk I think that those are completely understandable, even though I think it's important to get the word out that getting some of these benefits doesn't really matter for public charge purposes. And then finally, I thought that I should spend a few minutes, have left, on legalization. What's ahead? As I mentioned earlier, I think it's a national hypocrisy that we have essential workers who are undocumented. How could that be? In fact, we have instances of the government issuing papers to people saying they're essential. They are essential. They can go out, they can go to the workplace in spite of stay-at-home orders, but at the same time, these are folks that have really, and this gets back to Dr. Valenzuela's point about how this has deep roots in labor policy, really in many ways going back to slavery. And so we're really at this moment where we could have legislation that tries to do something about this, or at the very least, depending on how optimistic or pessimistic you are, at the very least, it's a moment where thinking about this and thinking about imagining what it would be like to have an immigration law that matched up more with the labor needs of the economy and the reality of labor markets, and also with racial justice, what that would look like. So I just want to flag the issues that have keep coming up again and again, and unfortunately become kind of the matrix for a lot of hard-nosed and frankly cynical bargaining on some of these issues. One is, who's included. This has been an issue. There's been, one of the things that Congress is going to be debating is where someone might say, we'll turn DACA into a path to citizenship and legal status, but we're not going to include anyone else. And so, or who would be included? Who would be, would it matter? Would it be, how close would it be to DACA? How much would it be general legalization? Who would be excluded? That's going to be a big debate. The other thing that is a big issue is what's offered. One of the more cynical offers that people who are very reluctant to offer legal status, what those folks might want to offer is, well, you can get legal status, but you don't get a path to citizenship. So that's up for bargaining. Protected status or path to citizenship. Does it include families? One of the issues with in 1986, but this is in legalization, but it's always been a debate. A point of debate is, is it just a worker or is it their families? And so this is also an issue that needs a lot of attention and a lot of thought. And how long is the path? There's a bill that passed Congress in 2013, but it would have had a very long path to citizenship. Up to 13 years, depending on the circumstances. And so, and so what's that going to be? And then the political context matters for this. I think we're going to see a lot of attempts to say we're going to have DACA turned into legal status, but you've got to pay a price legislatively, and the legislative price may well be more funding for a wall or something like this. So a lot more to say about this. Let me stop here. Again, I'm just really trying just to lay out what the issues are. The details don't matter. Well, they do matter, of course, as examples, but I think what we really have to sort of think about is what the issues are, what the trade-offs are, and the things to work on, and try to identify what the path forward is. So let me stop there and just hand it back to Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Dr. Motomura and Dr. Valenzuela, for those helpful presentations. Before we begin the question portion of our webinar, I would like to invite members from the Office of Immigrant Affairs and Unite Here Local 11, a hospitality labor union, to share about the experiences of essential workers, particularly immigrant workers, during this crisis. First, we have Michael Nobleza, a Fuse Corps Executive Fellow from the Office of Immigrant Affairs, to highlight ongoing initiatives in LA County.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad to be part of this conversation. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Michael Nobleza, and I am what is called a Fuse Corps Executive Fellow. Fuse Corps selects seasoned executives from the nonprofit and private sectors and puts them into one-year public service fellowships. And I named that to say that I'm a consultant with the county and not an official representative of the county. So I use it as a preface as I go on with my remarks. I've spent the past year working with the Los Angeles County Office of Immigrant Affairs, or OIA, helping immigrants living, working, and doing business in this 88 cities and unincorporated areas across Los Angeles County to connect with the services they need to thrive. Next slide, please. So Dr. Motomura and Dr. Valenzuela have really provided some deep reflections on the broader issues that we want to be looking at when it comes to essential workers. And what I want to do is integrate those reflections into how the county is beginning to think about recovery for our economy in this region. So I'll first start with reinforcing some of the major points that they made. Then I'm going to talk about what bringing an immigrant lens means to the work and what it tells us about how we might be able to support our immigrant essential workers. And finally, I'm going to tell you about specific ways that we're working with the OIA to think about leading the county in addressing the needs of our immigrants. Next slide, please. So I think those of us who live in LA County intuitively know that it's a culturally and economically diverse region. And I just want to underscore what that actually means for 10 million residents in the county. As you'll see in this slide, immigrants are a third of the population, about 3.6 million immigrants. And more than a majority of the students in the county have a parent who was born in another country. So all that to say, we'd be hard pressed to talk about LA County without talking about our immigrants, right? Next slide. And when we look specifically at our economy, we see immigrants aren't just part of the county economy, they're driving it. And this is significant when we consider that our economy is the 21st largest in the world, bigger than some countries. And immigrants make up the majority of our small business owners. They're half of our workforce. And immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, produce significant tax revenue for the county, which contradicts some of the ideas or thoughts or beliefs out there that immigrants are a drain on our social service system. Next slide. The state of California and LA County both have specific definitions of what constitutes an essential worker. And when we bring an immigrant lens, what we see is just how much immigrants are helping us survive this pandemic, a point that both of the professors had already made. So just to underscore, immigrants are a significant share of the essential workforce and therefore are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. Next slide. Even more, when we apply a gender lens, what we see is that immigrant women are being more impacted because they are a larger share of some of the essential work sectors. So they're the caregivers, the cleaners, the cooks in small restaurants. And so that's an intersectional lens we want to bring to our understanding of how we respond to this crisis. Next slide. So with this picture in mind, the county is in the process of envisioning an equity-driven economic recovery effort. We want to build back better and stronger, and more importantly, more fairly and equitably for our immigrants. So we're already looking at how we might use the disruptive nature of this crisis to capitalize on opportunities to improve the lives of our immigrant essential workers, including supporting them on launching businesses of their own, upskilling to help workers access jobs in high growth industries, and looking how we might intentionally center immigrants in our policymaking process. Next slide. And of course, there is one opportunity, economic opportunity specific to our immigrants. Gaining citizenship provides economic security for our immigrants and contributes to growth in our economy, which we definitely need right now. So you'll see in this call out box on the right that if the 750,000 immigrants eligible for citizenship in the county naturalize, it could potentially lead to economic growth north of $362 million in new tax revenue. Next slide, please. So to capitalize on this opportunity, I'm proposing to the county what we call the Los Angeles Immigrant Essential Workers Initiative. The goal of this initiative will be to tighten up the social safety net for immigrant essential workers by increasing usage of the variety of county services for which they qualify. And we'll use 3 strategies to accomplish this goal. These strategies were informed by an extensive listening tour that I conducted with key community stakeholders across the county. The first role, systems navigation. We want to help connect immigrants to wraparound services. The second, policy development. We will propose equity-focused policies that specifically center our immigrant essential workers. And the third goal or objective is narrative change. We want to help all Angelenos better understand just how essential our immigrants are to the county's economic health and success. Next slide, please. So even though we've yet to formally launch this initiative, we are already achieving some progress and success in overcoming barriers to access to information and services, part of those by necessity because of this crisis. So we've already begun to increase the county's capacity to better provide wraparound services, and also passing board legislation around some of the critical issues mentioned by the 2 professors. And then last slide, please. So looking forward, the OIA is focusing on bringing together all the key stakeholders within the immigrant service provider community to generate new ideas and solutions that specifically address immigrant essential workers, while at the same time continuing to educate community partners and the county workforce about what they need to best serve our immigrants. So I'll stop here, and if you have any questions for the OIA, you can certainly contact us at 1-800-593-8222, and we'll place that in the chat later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nobleza. Next, we will have a brief presentation from members of Unite Here Local 11, a hospitality labor union, to share their experiences. Joseph Murphy is an organizer from Unite Here Local 11 and will be assisting Araceli Diaz Carvajal and Juan Andres Flores. Both are workers from Laguna Cliffs Marriott Hotel. The Laguna Cliffs Marriott Hotel is owned by the University of California. Therefore, Araceli and Juan are both members of the University of California community. The workers will speak in English, so for those of you who are currently listening using the Spanish translation, please mute your phone and then mute the Zoom audio to listen to Araceli's and Juan's testimony. Joseph Murphy will provide the English translation for these workers' testimonies.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us be a part of this. We appreciate it, and it's good to be here. So, Araceli, si quiere empezar a presentarse y explicar, y te traduzco. Quitas el micrófono y pones el cámara.
No puedo quitar la cámara, el micrófono ya. Pero la cámara no, me dice que el anfitrión luego espera que inicie su video.
If anybody on the tech side can turn on her camera, she's not able to, but in the meantime, she can start. So, de todos modos, empieza, Araceli.
Sí, hola. Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Araceli Díaz Carvajal. Tengo 10 años trabajando en el barrio Laguna Clip de aquí de Danapoy. Nosotros nos ha afectado mucho lo de la pandemia porque pues cerraron nuestro lugar de trabajo. Lo cerraron a partir como más o menos del 22 de marzo. A mediados de abril, más o menos, no conforme con quedarnos sin trabajo, a mediados de abril nos mandaron una carta de despido a todos los trabajadores. Aparte de eso...
Okay. We'll take a translation pause. So, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Araceli Diaz, and I've been working in ya te podemos ver, ya está bien. So, so my name is Araceli Diaz. I worked in housekeeping for 10 years at the Laguna Cliffs Marriott, a hotel in Dana Point, California. The pandemic has affected us a lot. So our hotel closed in mid-March, and we were all without work. But the management ownership of the hotel felt like that wasn't even enough. And so then in mid-April, they sent a letter out and terminated all of us, 200 of the employees at the hotel. Okay.
Nosotros hablamos para el hotel, nos dijeron que que era que era para que pudiéramos meter el desempleo cuando muchos de nosotros ya lo habíamos metido. No conforme con eso, nos llegaron unos pagarés para que empezáramos a pagar la aseguranza. A partir del 1 de mayo, nos llegaron los pagarés hasta el mes de diciembre. Nosotros todos pues nos quedamos sin trabajo. Muchos de nosotros no recibimos ninguna ayuda. Entonces para nosotros fue muy difícil porque pues no teníamos ni dinero a veces para pagar la renta, o pagábamos renta o comida, o pagábamos la aseguranza. Entonces nosotros nos empezamos a reunir todos y con ayuda, todos los trabajadores, y con ayuda de la unión empezamos a pelear que nos regresara nuestro trabajo, que nos extendieran la aseguranza mientras estuviéramos fuera de nuestro trabajo. ¿Quieres traducir, Jess?
Yeah, yeah. So she said that after we got the termination letters in mid-April, the company's excuse was that it was so that we could collect unemployment. However, many of us had already filed for and were receiving unemployment, so it was clearly just an excuse. They did not need to fire us. They also then sent us bills if we wanted to keep being able to have our insurance, which they billed us hundreds of dollars, and they had the little slips to pay from April through the end of the year. And then some of our coworkers did not qualify for unemployment, and so didn't have any money. So it was hard because people were making choices between paying rent, paying for their insurance, or having food for their families. So what we did was a lot of us got together and organized through the union and worked on changing and winning some of these issues. Okay, sigue.
Y entonces con la ayuda de la unión, nosotros y la unión de todos los trabajadores hemos logrado que nos regresen el trabajo, que nos extiendan la aseguranza, pero también nosotros queremos que nos ayuden a meter la unión allá dentro de nuestro trabajo, porque muchos también de nosotros no tenemos ningún seguro bueno. Entonces, con ellos hemos logrado que nos regresaran el trabajo, que nos extendieran la aseguranza, y que regresen todos los trabajadores que no tienen documentos con su señoría, sin revisión de papeles. Entonces, yo los invito a que firmen a todos ustedes la petición por internet para que nos puedan ayudar. Y también el jueves 23 de julio los invitamos a venir al hotel para la acción que vamos a hacer allí. Gracias.
Yeah. And so Araceli said, so through organizing, through getting our coworkers together from all the different departments in the hotel, and with support of UC students and professors, we've been able to win that they return our jobs by seniority, and also that no one will have to be rehired, and therefore checking of immigration papers, everyone will be coming back. And also we've won the health insurance extensions now for 2 months, for June and for July, and not having to pay that while we're out. And now we are focused on winning the union because we want to address the other injustices at the hotel. And so she invited folks, and we'll share it in the chat, to sign a petition, since the UC system owns the hotel, to be able to support by signing an online petition. And then secondly, we'll have an action next Thursday, the 23rd at 10 a.m. outside of the hotel if people want to come and support that. So, gracias, Araceli.
Gracias.
Andrés te quiere presentar y decir un poco. Quitarlo del mute del micrófono y poner cámara. Ok. Ahí te vemos. All right.
Sí, ¿cómo están? Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Juan Andrés Flores. Yo trabajo para el Marriott por 20 años. La una que es Marriott y Dana Point. Es lo mismo que Araceli dijo. Y bueno, estamos luchando por que la unión entre ahí, porque muchos maltratos de parte de los managers, todo, la paga muy mala y bueno, prácticamente maltrato a veces psicológico, que si no vas te ponen write-up y todo eso. Y bueno, quisiera que ustedes nos ayuden a hacer la petición, como dijo Araceli. Y bueno, eso es todo. Esperamos que nos ayuden ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Awesome. Thank you, Andre. So, my name is Juan Andres Flores. I worked in banquets at the Laguna Cliffs Marriott for the past 20 years. And the reason we're organizing the union is about the mistreatment that we have, both in the pay, but also psychologically. For example, they'll threaten if you don't come, you're going to get a write-up. And so, said a lot of similar to what Araceli said, but about being able to sign the petition and help and support us. So I think that's what we got. So again, thank you, and I'll just emphasize, I think that one of the big issues is people not qualifying for unemployment, because obviously that's a huge loss of income. And we've seen that the few people who are working are not working by seniority, but they're being offered hours because they're the favorites of management, which again is an inconsistency there. So I think we can end there unless there's any other questions or anything. And thank you again for having us.
Thank you so much for sharing those experiences. I'm seeing that there's a lot of interest in getting access to that petition link. So we'll make sure to be able to circulate that in some way, hopefully through the chat, but also that's something that perhaps we can send out through our mailing list as well, or on social media. So we want to make sure to be able to get that in the hands of as many people as possible. There you have it. So we're now going to shift into the interactive question and answer portion of this event. I'm going to start by asking our panelists a few questions. Some of them are ones that I or other members of the task force came up with. Some of them are ones that I drew from the chat that were posted previously. You're also welcome, and we really encourage you to pose questions in the Q&A feature throughout this interactive portion. And we'll go for about 20 minutes or so. So please do post your questions, because we have some fantastic folks here today that I know everyone really wants to hear their answers. Okay, so the first question that I had is just that, given the nature of this task force, a major focus of ours is on children and families. And in listening just a moment ago to Andres and Araceli, one of the clearest things to me is how this pandemic is hitting families. What do you all see as really the biggest consequence of this pandemic on families and on children? And you can probably hear mine screaming in the background. I apologize, but I'm trying to keep them slightly away from the computer. And that's really open to any of the panelists. What do you see as one of the biggest sort of consequences of this pandemic on families and children, particularly families that have essential immigrant workers in them?
So I can try to take a quick stab. As somebody who's privileged and who receives a check on a regular basis, my wife also works and I have 3 boys. This transition to stay at home and work has been extremely difficult, not easy. But I'm not sure I can come anywhere near comparing myself and my situation with somebody who has to live on a check-by-check basis. So on a very regular basis, families are having to make very difficult decisions about either caring for their children or leaving young children with older siblings while heading out to work and endangering their lives. They can very well come back home with the virus and spread it to their children. And so I think what's a little bit different, or what I might want to emphasize, is the emotional toll that has on families, on children, on working parents. It's horrible. And again, my reference is my own household, which doesn't compare to what I think other households are going through. And so we have to pay attention to how we intervene, not only financially in terms of more resources, but also via mental health and other sorts of interventions to help out in this regard.
Yeah, let me just jump in and, I agree with everything Abel just said about the issues and sort of the reality of this. One of the things, if you look back across American history, that there are a lot of things not to be proud of, in fact, many things to be ashamed of. But one of the things that we do see as a consistent strand is really trying to look to the next generation and to really enable people, children, to really fulfill their ambitions and live out their lives. And this is the reason we give citizenship to people who are born in this country. And so one of the more cynical and really horrible things we've seen out of this administration is something that illustrated in the treatment of children who have one undocumented parent. They don't get the CARES Act check. I mean, that's just, it's going after the kids in a way that's antithetical to the way we've treated children in this country. So we really see that. And of course, this goes back to another issue we haven't talked about at all today, but it's very much on my mind, which is the family separation of children from their parents. And so that's really been, and so you really, see that, you really see that as well. And, I'm glad, Abel, you mentioned the sort of this position, I guess we're in, getting, being on a payroll, that kind of thing. But I tell you, I mean, I look at this in a very personal way because, my father was a cook at a hotel for his whole life, and he would have been laid off by now. And he was just like working at the Marriott. That's what he did. He was a cook. So I look at sort of this whole episode through what he would have gone through and what it would have meant for me to be a child in our family.
Thank you for that. I really resonate with the comments that both of you shared just there. So I think one of the things that we're all left with when we have this discussion is what are some of the ways that we can really be working? I think there's kind of two or multiple aspects to this, but one is how can we best work for those of us who especially do have any sort of position of power or privilege to be a good ally and to be an effective ally at this particular moment in time, especially for our essential immigrant workers. And also thinking about what are ways that we can best empower our essential immigrant workers to find ways to really sort of write their own narrative for what this looks like moving forward as we respond to this pandemic.
So that's a tough question. I'll try to take a quick stab. I recall having a conversation with a student shortly after campus closure, and then talking about post UCLA and transitioning in such a depressing, horrific, shuttered economy, and what this means, right? And I paused and we had a conversation. And I know in my presentation, I talked about pandemic opportunities, right? And it was mostly in a pessimistic sort of negative context. On the other end, when I talk about planning for a pandemic recovery that's equal and fair, you're beginning to see a much more robust civil society. And here I'm talking about community-based organizations, unions that have been devastated, okay, let's be clear, by the shuttering of the economy. But they're convening, they're organizing. There are other efforts that are nascent, that are just emerging. Why is it nascent? Why are they just emerging? we're smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. And while we're doing some recovery efforts, I suspect that's going to be ongoing and will take many years, right? So there are opportunities to either create your own community-based organizations and or work with them and or with organized labor. There's also other, I think, opportunities in government jobs and sector that can all be a part of coming to the table to organize in a more fair and inclusive pandemic recovery. There's efforts going on, and while it's not clear right now, there will be opportunities. They're starting to emerge. Everybody's reeling and figuring out how to make things a whole lot better.
You know, one thing, there's so much to say about this, and so let me just limit myself to a couple quick things. I mean, one is that this is not just a time for experts or so-called experts, right? I mean, each of us is an expert in our own way, through our life experiences, through our perspective, maybe our training, and our community ties. And so I think a lot of it is each of us kind of thinking about what we know, what we can share, how we can change people's minds. It's not just a time for, you know, for people who are have got that professional license. Each of us has a role to play. The other thing is that, you know, I'm not a scholar of, you know, social movements or anything like that, but, you know, I'm not, I'll say, well, I just said it's not about experts. I'm not an expert on it, but I'll say something anyway. And some of you have heard me tell the story, so forgive me if you've heard this more than once, but I remember going to, I was in Berlin, Germany, and going to a place where the Berlin Wall used to stand. And there's only like a little section there, and this is 30 years after Berlin Wall fell down. Everyone thought the Berlin Wall would last forever. Remember seeing a middle school group going to and the teacher was saying, you know, kids, there used to be a wall here, but it came down. And the reason I tell the story is because it's hard to imagine, it's hard to know. People didn't know the wall was going to come down the week before. I mean, a lot of the East German leaders thought it would stay up forever, but I think it took a lot of people with the faith to do what they thought was right without necessarily knowing that the Berlin Wall would come down the next day or the next week or anything like that. They just kept doing the right thing and something happened. That's just kind of a lesson that you don't work on things with the promise of success, but with the faith that you're moving in the right direction.
I'd just like to say, I think there's also an opportunity to be creative about this. So in the city of LA, our union passed a law about retention and rehire for hospitality workers. So hotels can't use this as an opportunity to fire people and hire new folks once this is over. At some point, they'll need cooks, dishwashers, servers, etc., and they should bring those people back that were there before, as opposed to finding somebody cheaper. And now AB 3216 is a state bill that we're trying to pass through, you know, in entire California. So I think that, you know, there's an opportunity to everybody in the press wants to talk about COVID, and so push workers' rights with that spin on it.
So that actually brings me to another question that was posted. You mentioned the press. What role do you think the media can be playing right now in its portrayal of immigrant essential workers, and what could be improved specifically with media portrayals?
They could follow some people around and share what we've shared here. I think, you know, that's always good.
Sure, I think they could do a better job of being more nuanced. You know, I try to bring some of that to the conversation when I was sharing the different kinds of essential workers, and even my slides differed a little bit from Michael's, for example, in terms of who they are. There are many, many out there. You know, I like to see some of that played out CNN and some other kind of feel-good stories. I think that's important. I think we need to have different narratives about essential and immigrant workers. I think the conversation should be at the national level. I think there should be an honest conversation about safety premiums or additional compensation for workers who are exposed or who are in a higher probability of exposure. Paying workers a bonus, it's time-honored tradition in the United States for all kinds of different reasons, right? There's no reason why essential and frontline workers should be treated any differently when it comes to something like an incentive, so that at least there's extra resources, income being put on the table for exchange of labor power. I hate to be so crass that way, but there are ways to make things better for workers.
You know, I was thinking about the question, and when I think about what the media could do, my first reaction is, what media are you talking about? You know, I mean, it's like, I know media that are doing a decent job, maybe even a good job. I know media that are completely like, you know, don't really count as really kind of any kind of honest look at this. And so I'm actually thinking not about specific things, but sort of what the world of media looks like. And the other thing is that, you know, of course, media isn't just newspaper.
Right.
So this is another sort of twist of topics, but I just want to address some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A to make sure that we're being responsive to them.
And TV and radio, of course, about those kinds of things too.
Sorry. So one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A is that one of the biggest debates lately has been about whether or not to open schools in the fall. LAUSD just announced, much to my disappointment for a personal basis, that they will not be having in-person courses, at least at the beginning of the fall semester. How do you see school reopening during this pandemic affecting immigrant families and childcare? And specifically, just from my perspective, that seems like it plays a really big role in one's ability to work during this time.
It's extremely troublesome. I have 3 school-age children, including a kindergartner who's finding Zooming extremely difficult. I think this is one of those questions that we have to smack ourselves and think about the pros and cons in multiple ways. If we close schools, then we should provide families who have children who are dependent to immigrant parents, for example, with resources so that they can care for them at home. That wasn't a part of course, the CARES or other sorts of debates, but there have to be some real investments, I think, if we do open schools in terms of making them more safe. Money has to come from somewhere. 2, they have to be super safe. I worry. I'm at that age where if I get that virus, I'm compromised. And so I worry about my children going back to school and then coming back. But again, I'm in a much more privileged situation where I can stay home. I can manage their Zooming. And so it's a different context when it comes to immigrant households who need school for lots of different reasons, including the importance of occupying or taking care of their children during the day. That's an important and valuable role and service. If we close the schools, we need to then compensate or provide resources for parents so they can either stay home or pay the bills.
I'll just add that I think if we lived in a country that took the welfare of, or I should say, if we lived in a country that respected workers more, I think we would have handled the whole situation differently. Yeah. We would have had different kind of leadership, different choices. And we would have done what I think has happened in some other countries where scientists have been more influential. And I can imagine if you look back, let's say in late March, I can imagine steps that could have been taken that would allow the reopening of schools much more safely, which then would allow families who can't telecommute to sustain themselves and sustain their children. And but I think it's unfortunately very telling that that's not the way that leadership in this country has handled the situation.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who posted questions in the Q&A. Sorry that we didn't get to them all, but some really valuable discussion there. So that will conclude the Q&A portion. I think we're just going to have a quick wrap up and then say thank you to everyone who participated in this evening's event.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Berganza, and I'm IYTF Student President. With that Q&A portion, our webinar draws to a close. Thank you all for attending today, and thank you to Professor Motomura, Professor Valenzuela, Professor Silvers, Mr. Nobleza, and Ms. Peterson for their presentations. And a special thanks to everyone involved in the creation of this webinar. We've included a feedback form in the chat and would be grateful for your feedback so we can improve our future webinars. If you are interested in working with our student organization, feel free to email us at iytf.scope@gmail.com. If you are interested in accessing both the presentation slides and/or the recording, they're available on the IYTF website, which will be linked in the chat. Thank you again for everyone coming out.
Be healthy and safe.